What part of get out didn't you understand? Why are you still here?
"Why are you still here?" said the guard to the old black man in the museum. The question drifted through the hollow halls of the United States Air Force Museum, echoing off polished floors and the suspended wings of aircraft frozen in time. The hour was late. The visitors had gone. The lights had dimmed to their soft night glow, and all that remained was the hum of silence and the scent of oil, dust, and memory. John stood quietly inside the museum. His back, straight though age had curved his bones long ago, his breath moved slow and steady, rising in the cold air as if time itself waited for him to finish what he'd come to do. He wore an old jacket, its fabric worn and faded, holding the scent of places long behind him. To most, the museum was a shrine of metal and glass, place that told stories of war and courage through plaques and photographs. But to John, it was something else entirely. It was a graveyard of spirits, and every plane hanging above him was a tombstone that whispered. The guard, Flix, had seen him come in before closing time. He had walked slow, taking in every detail as if he knew the ghosts by name. Flix wasn't a man who scared easily, but there was something in the old man's stillness that unsettled him. It wasn't confusion or madness. It was familiarity, like he was home. The sound of Flix's footsteps echoed softly as he approached, but the old man didn't move. He just stood there in the middle of the hall, surrounded by relics that gleamed like captured stars. Above him, the wings of ancient aircraft seemed to stretch wider in the dim light, casting long, haunting shadows across the floor. John's eyes drifted slowly from one display to the next. He didn't need to read the signs. He already knew the stories they told. He had lived them in ways no words on a plaque could capture. The air was heavy with memory, and every faint glimmer of metal seemed alive with a pulse from the past. There were planes from every era, machines that had cut through clouds, that had carried men into storms they never returned from. The polished chrome and painted symbols looked proud, but to John they were faces, not artifacts. Faces of friends, brothers, and young men who'd gone up in disguise that never gave them back. The low hum of the museum's air system filled the silence. Somewhere a vent clanked open, and a faint metallic creak ran through the ceiling. The sound didn't startle John. He had grown used to the language of metal. To him, the museum spoke. He turned slowly toward the far end of the hall, where the displays changed from grand bombers and fighters to smaller, more personal exhibits, uniforms, dog tags, medals, and photos. There, behind glass, were the stories that history books had shortened to a paragraph. The Tuskegee Airmen, the black pilots who had fought 2 wars at once, one in the air, and one against the walls of their own country's blindness. John's steps were soft but sure. He walked as though following an invisible path. When he reached that exhibit, he stopped again. The lighting there was dimmer, older somehow, the color of fading memories. The polished floor reflected his shadow like a ghost's twin. His hand trembled slightly as he placed it against the glass. Inside the case sat a folded flight cap, a photograph, and a single rusted pair of goggles. The label beneath the display bore a name he recognized. It wasn't just a name. It was a wound that had never fully healed. The museum grew quieter. The hum deepened, almost as if the air was holding its breath. Flix stood at a distance now, his flashlight lowered, watching with unease. Something about that old man made the air feel charged, like a storm waiting to break. And then the stillness shifted. It began with the faintest vibration, a trembling in the air, soft but unmistakable. The hanging aircraft above them seemed to sway ever so slightly, though there was no wind inside the sealed building. The hum of the lights flickered. John's eyes closed. For a heartbeat, he wasn't in the museum anymore. He was young again. The roar of engines filled his ears. The smell of aviation fuel and hot metal wrapped around him. The cockpit rattled beneath his hands. He felt the sky tremble. He felt the fear and fire of being alive in a world where death came with wings. The hum became a roar. The shadows of planes above him shifted, their silhouettes alive in the flickering light. The faint sound of propellers turning filled the air. Soft at first, then growing stronger, as though the engines of memory were waking. Flix froze. His flashlight beam shook. The air seemed thicker, heavier, the line between real and unreal beginning to blur. The radio on his belt crackled, whispering static that sounded almost like voices. John didn't move. He stood there, hand pressed to the glass, as the sounds of long-dead engines rose around him. The echo of men shouting orders, the faint rhythm of Morse code, the heartbeat of history returning, alive and restless. Then silence. The lights steadied. The air settled. The sound vanished as if swallowed whole. When Flix blinked, the old man was gone. Only the empty floor remained, glimmering faintly under the overhead lights. No footprints, no sound. Nothing but the quiet whisper of the vents and the museum's still breath. Flix stepped forward, hesitant. He reached the same glass case the old man had touched, and there, clear as day, was a handprint, faint but real. He touched it, and the warmth of it startled him. He leaned closer. That's when he saw it, a faint inscription etched into the metal edge of the display. It wasn't on the museum's records. It was too small, too deliberate, like someone had scratched it in long ago. It read one word, John, the name on the tag beneath the flight cap, the same name whispered by the air itself. Flix felt his heart pound in his chest. He looked up at the silent planes overhead, at their dark, unmoving forms. But the stillness wasn't empty anymore. It was aware, watching. The air in the museum had changed. It was no longer just a place for stories of the past. It had become a bridge. And somewhere between the hum of the lights and the silence of steel, the old man's spirit still lingered. The night was not yet over. The museum was never truly silent again after that night. When the sound of the old man's last presence faded, something lingered behind. The air inside the United States Air Force. Museum no longer felt still, it felt waiting, as if every machine, every shadow, every piece of metal suspended above the floor had begun to breathe in rhythm with something unseen. Flix stood in the center of the vast hall long after the lights stopped flickering. The echo of his own heartbeat filled the emptiness. The faint scent of leather, oil, and something, older, like burnt air after lightning still, hung around the Tuskegee Airmen display. He didn't move for a long time. His body wanted to leave, but his spirit felt rooted in that place, as if the old man's ghost had left something behind that demanded witness. Outside, the wind howled across the dark parking lot, brushing against the tall glass panels that made up the museum's facade. The world beyond was ordinary. Streetlights, highways, the slow drift of late-night cars. But inside, time had slowed. Flix's flashlight trembled, slightly in his hand as he began. Another slow walk down the central aisle. He passed under the wings of bombers, jets, and gliders that stretched above him like a forest of frozen birds. Their shadows twisted as he moved, bending in strange ways across the floor. It almost looked like the planes were moving when he wasn't looking, shifting just enough to be noticed out of the corner of his eye. The sound of his shoes against the polished floor echoed back to him, slightly delayed. It was a small thing, but he noticed it, the way the echo came half a second later than it should have, as though the building itself was listening, deciding when to answer. He walked past the old war displays, through the section dedicated to flight suits and training manuals, until he reached the far side of the hall. There, an old propeller engine sat on a pedestal. The information card explained that it came from a wreckage discovered. Decades after the war, a recovery from a forgotten crash site overseas. The card said the pilot's remains had never been found. The same last name appeared again, John. Flix stared at it, his breath shallow. He tried to convince himself it was coincidence, but the thought wouldn't settle. The museum was full of names, hundreds of them, thousands even. But that one seemed to find him again and again, whispering from glass and metal. The lights above flickered once more, soft but steady, as if acknowledging his thoughts. Flix looked up at the suspended aircraft. Their metallic bellies gleamed faintly in the dim glow. For the first time, he noticed that one of the planes of a training craft from the 1940s had something etched faintly near its nose. It wasn't visible under normal light, but the flicker revealed it for a heartbeat, a handprint, the same shape, the same placement as the one he'd seen on the glass case earlier. The air turned colder. Somewhere deep inside the building, the faint sound of footsteps began. Not quick or hurried, slow, deliberate, measured. The kind of footsteps made by someone who knew where they were going. Flix froze. His instincts told him he was alone, but the sound was too real. It came from the direction of the older exhibits, from where John had last stood. The flashlight's beam wavered slightly as he turned toward the sound. His mouth was dry, his pulse heavy in his ears. The sound continued, step by step, echoing softly against the floor. But it didn't sound like hard shoes now. It sounded lighter, as if whoever was walking didn't quite touch the ground. Flix began to move forward, one slow step at a time. The museum seemed to stretch as he walked, each section longer, each plane taller, the shadows wider. The rows of exhibits felt endless, repeating, like he was walking through memory instead of space. When he reached the Tuskegee section again, the footsteps stopped. The air had gone heavy, pressing down on his chest. The glass display cases gleamed softly, reflecting his own anxious face back at him from a dozen angles. But in one reflection, in the faint corner of his eye, he saw something behind him. A figure. Old still, dressed in an old jacket. Flix spun around, but there was nothing there. The aisle behind him was empty. Yet something remained, the faint impression of motion, like air displaced by a passing presence. The smell of old leather grew stronger. The temperature dropped again, sharp enough that Flix could see his own breath. And then he heard it. Faint, distant, almost too soft to be real. The sound of an engine turning over. One, then another, then another. The hum of flight, not mechanical but ghostly, blooming through the air like a heartbeat. The planes above him glimmered faintly as their shadows deepened. The hum grew stronger, merging into a chorus of invisible engines. It wasn't loud, but it filled everything. The walls, the floor, the very air. Flix looked up. For a moment, he could swear the aircraft weren't hanging anymore. They were moving, floating, turning as if alive. The old planes from wars long past shimmered in faint light, their propellers spinning in silence. In the glow above, faint outlines began to appear in the cockpits. Shapes of men, pilots, sitting still, their faces lost to shadow. Flix took a step back. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He simply watched, as something deep inside him understood what was happening. The museum was remembering. This wasn't haunting. It was memory replaying itself, a moment from the past bleeding through time. The old man hadn't left, not really. He had only returned home. And in his return, he had awakened the others. The hum grew steadier, then began to fade, replaced by the soft rhythm of breathing. Not his own, but many. A deep collective sigh that seemed to fill the space like air returning to lungs. Flix turned again toward the Tuskegee display. The photograph inside the case, the one beside the folded flight cap, had changed. Where once it showed a small group of pilots standing before their plane, now there was one more man among them, an older version of the same face, John. Flix blinked and the photo was normal again. But the feeling stayed. He stepped back slowly, every nerve alive. He didn't know what he'd seen or what it meant, but he understood one thing. This was no ordinary haunting. This was purpose. The night outside deepened. The wind rattled the glass walls of the museum like distant thunder. Flix turned off his flashlight, letting the dim emergency lights paint the floor in silver shadows. For a long while, he simply stood there, letting the hum of the building wash over him. The museum had always been a place of honor, a place where history was polished and preserved. But that night, Flix began to realize that history doesn't die. It doesn't rest behind glass. It breathes. It waits. And some memories, some spirits, don't want to be forgotten. As the hours crawled toward dawn, Flix finally turned to leave. But before he reached the exit, he heard one final sound behind him, faint, distant yet clear as a whisper carried on the wind. It was the soft click of boots against a hangar floor. A man's steady stride. He didn't turn back. He didn't need to. He already knew who it was. And when the morning staff arrived hours later, they found the museum quiet and clean. But in the reflection of the main hall's glass panels, caught by the rising sun, there was the faint outline of a man in an old jacket, standing proud beneath the wings of history. Watching, waiting, home. Morning came slow over the United States Air Force Museum. The pale sun pushed through the glass walls, spilling long beams across the floor, stretching like ghostly fingers through the quiet. The planes gleamed softly in that half-light, their metal bodies glowing like the surface of still water. It should have felt peaceful, but the peace that filled the air was too heavy, too aware, the kind that comes not after noise, but after truth. Flix didn't go home that morning. He couldn't. He sat on a bench near the main corridor, hands folded, eyes hollow from a sleepless night. The museum was different now. He could feel it in his bones. The walls held whispers. The air vibrated faintly with memory. He tried to tell himself that what he had seen, the old man, the lights, the engines, the photograph changing, was only exhaustion. But deep down, something inside him had already accepted that it was more. He had witnessed something sacred. The cleaning crew arrived around sunrise, their chatter light and oblivious. They saw nothing unusual. They didn't feel the shift in the air, or notice the faint warmth still radiating from the Tuskegee display. They worked around Flix, unaware that the space they swept and dusted had become a crossing between worlds. When they were gone and the museum fell silent again, the weight returned. Flix rose slowly, the floor creaking beneath his boots, and began another slow walk through the halls. The light outside had grown brighter, but the corners of the museum still clung to shadow, as if refusing to let go of the night before. He passed the rows of planes, each one a monument of metal and memory. There was something deeply human in their stillness, the kind of stillness that carried echoes. They were more than machines. They were vessels of stories, heavy with the souls of those who had ridden them through fire and sky. As he moved deeper into the main hall, he noticed something new. Dust, fine and silvery, had gathered in the air, moving gently like breath. It caught the sunlight and shimmered in faint shapes. The outlines of wings, the curve of a flight helmet, the flicker of a hand raised in salute. The air itself seemed to form memories, brief, beautiful, and fleeting. Flix stopped before the Tuskegee section again. The glass gleamed clean, but the handprint from the night before was gone. In its place, a faint smear remained like the ghost of touch fading away. He looked closer and saw something else, a feather-thin crack running down the side of the case. Inside, the folded flight cap had shifted slightly, angled toward the front as though someone had moved it to face him. For a moment, the air stilled completely, and then came the hum. Soft at first, a whisper beneath the breath of the building. Then louder, deeper, like the beginning of a song from somewhere far below the floor. The hum was low, steady, rhythmic. The same sound he'd heard the night before. The sound of an engine, not mechanical but alive. It rolled through the museum in slow waves, rising and falling. It came from the walls, from the displays, from the very steel beams that held the ceiling aloft. The planes above seemed to respond, their metal skins catching the vibration, and glowing faintly as though remembering flight. Flix stood frozen in the center of the hall as the sound deepened. He closed his eyes and listened. Beneath the hum were other sounds, faint, overlapping, human. Voices, layered in whispers, calling from the past. Laughter commands prayer, the heartbeat of a time that refused to die. And among those whispers was one he recognized, the same voice that had stood before him the night before. The voice of the old man in the jacket, John. The hum filled the museum, but it wasn't frightening. It was sacred. It was grief and honor and love all tangled together, vibrating through steel and stone. The air grew thick with warmth, though the temperature stayed cold. It felt as if invisible hands had filled the space, touching the very soul of the building. And then, from the far corner of the hall, the light began to change. The morning sun faded. The colors deepened. The clean brightness of day melted into something golden, aged and trembling, the light of memory. The exhibits around Flix began to shift, their details softening. The ropes and placards faded away, replaced by the faint outlines of figures moving through the hall. Soldiers, mechanics, pilots, all made of light and dust, all busy with work that had been done long ago. The museum had become what it once represented, a living airfield. Flix didn't move. He couldn't. He was standing in a moment between time, surrounded by ghosts who didn't know they were ghosts. The faint echo of boots on the floor surrounded him, the rhythm of men moving with purpose. Among them, one figure stood apart, still, proud, and centered. An old man wearing an old jacket. His face was calm, his posture straight. The light that shaped him pulsed faintly, as though alive. John. Flix's breath caught, but he didn't speak. There were no words to be said. He only watched as the old man turned his head slightly toward the Tuskegee display, though now it wasn't a display at all, but a row of men preparing to board a plane. Their laughter was faint but real, their faces full of the hope that came before the mission. John's hand rose in salute. The others mirrored him. The engines above roared to life again. Not the quiet hum from before, but full thunder. The sound filled every inch of the building, shaking the air, rattling the floor. Yet nothing broke. Nothing fell. It was not chaos. It was power. Flix shielded his eyes from the brightness that flooded the hall. The figures of men, the planes, the very air shimmered in gold and silver light. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was gone. The museum returned to stillness. The hum vanished. The light dimmed back to morning. Everything was where it had been. The exhibits, the glass, the quiet order of history restored. But the air was different. Flix felt it in his chest, deep and certain. The building had been blessed by remembrance. The old man hadn't been trapped. He hadn't been haunting. He had been waiting to finish what he started, to return something that was never given to him, acknowledgement. And now the museum carried his memory not as an echo, but as presence. Flix turned to leave, but as he did, something caught his eye. On the floor beneath the Tuskegee display lay a small object, one that hadn't been there before. He bent down and picked it up carefully. It was a single aged flight button, the kind worn on old leather jackets. Tarnished but intact, the kind used by pilots long before his time. Flix turned it over in his hand. There was something engraved on the back. 2 words. Still here. The message was simple, but it hit deep. It wasn't defiance, it was declaration. A statement of endurance, of spirit that outlasted time, metal and history itself. Flix closed his fist around the button and looked up once more at the great wings above him. The planes hung silent again, but they no longer seemed dead. They seemed alive, guardians of stories that would never fade. The museum was quiet again, but it was not empty. And somewhere, unseen but certain, the old man still stood within those halls, watching, guarding, remembering, because some stories once awakened never rest again. Days passed after that morning, but the feeling never left the museum. It lingered in the quiet like the echo of a hymn after the choir has gone home. The air itself seemed to carry memory now, not heavy, not fearful, but full. The kind of fullness that hums with meaning, the kind that says, something sacred happened here. Flix kept working his rounds. He said nothing to the others. The world outside the glass walls moved on, the families with cameras, the children pointing at fighter jets, the veterans with distant eyes. Life continued as it always did. But beneath the laughter and footsteps, the museum had changed. It had become alive with history that breathed. Every night when the doors closed and the last visitor left, Flix would walk the halls again. He would pause before the Tuskegee display and look at the folded cap inside the case. It seemed brighter somehow, though no new light touched it. He would feel the same warmth on the air, faint but real, as if gratitude itself had taken shape. Sometimes, he thought he could hear the faint sound of a propeller cutting through clouds. Not loud, but whisper soft, just enough to stir the heart. Sometimes the faintest scent of jet fuel and rain would rise from nowhere, fade and vanish. He didn't chase the moments anymore. He simply let them happen. One night, about a week later, a storm rolled over the museum, the kind of storm that seemed to speak low and deep, with lightning that lit the sky like veins of fire. The glass walls trembled with the wind. The rain struck like applause. Flix made his final rounds that evening slower than usual. The storm outside gave the aircraft shadows a restless energy. The lights flickered. The ceiling creaked. It was a night that carried weight, the kind of night when memories walk. When he reached the far end of the hall, the hum returned, faint at first, then steady. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once. The museum lights dimmed, not from power loss, but from something older, more deliberate. The sound of engines and low, deep, powerful, rolled through the air again. It was familiar now, no longer terrifying. The sound was full of purpose. Flix stopped walking. His heart pounded not with fear, but with reverence. The floor beneath his boots seemed to vibrate with energy, and from the corner of his vision, the old light began to glow again, that golden, living shimmer. It rose slowly, moving down the length of the hall like a sunrise in motion. The planes glowed with it, the glass cases reflected it, and the entire museum filled with a presence that was too vast to name. The light gathered near the Tuskegee section. And then he was there. John. The old man stood again, just as he had before, still, proud, calm. The same old jacket, the same quiet dignity, but there was something different this time. A completeness, a peace. His presence was not a haunting now. It was farewell. Flix didn't move. He didn't need to. The old man's gaze was fixed not on him, but on the plains above. The golden light around him pulsed once like a heartbeat, and the hum of engines deepened until it sounded like thunder rolling through the heavens. One by one, the shadows of the aircraft began to move. The old planes, bombers, fighters, gliders, all shimmered with faint life. Their wings shifted slightly, the air bending beneath them as though they were preparing for flight. The glass rattled. The floor trembled. The storm outside roared louder, its lightning flashing through the glass walls like camera flashes from the past. And then the museum was no longer a museum. It was a runway. The walls stretched into distance and the air filled with light. The aircraft that hung suspended above began to move, their propellers spinning, their shapes solidifying. Ghostly pilots appeared inside the cockpits, men of all shades and ages, their faces calm and determined. At the front of them all stood John. No longer old, no longer tired, young again as he had been, ready to take to the skies. The engines roared to full strength, shaking the air with power and pride. The golden light blazed bright enough to blind, and for a single instant, Flix could see them. Hundreds of figures, hundreds of spirits rising with the planes, their flight forming a storm of memory and glory. It was not chaos, it was ascension. The sound rose higher, sharper, more beautiful than thunder. It became a song. A sound of freedom, of forgiveness, of flight finally completed. Flix felt his knees weaken. He dropped to the floor, not out of fear, but in reverence. He didn't understand everything, but he knew what he was seeing. He was witnessing the last flight of the forgotten. The light swelled to a brilliant white. Then it all faded, piece by piece, like a sunrise turning back into night. The hum quieted. The rain softened. The air stilled. When Flix opened his eyes, the museum was whole again, silent, unmoved. Every plane hung exactly where it always had. The lights glowed soft and steady. The storm outside was breaking apart, its thunder rolling away into distance. He stood slowly. The air smelled clean, not of oil and metal now, but of rain and sky. He turned toward the Tuskegee section one last time. The case was unchanged. The cap was still folded, the photograph still resting beside it. But beneath the glass, something new had appeared. A small tag, old and worn, lying beside the cap. It wasn't part of the exhibit before. Flix leaned close to read it. Etched into the surface in faint, careful handwriting were 3 words. Home at last. Flix closed his eyes. The air around him was still but warm, as if someone had laid a comforting hand on his shoulder. He didn't need to look. He knew the old man was gone, not vanished, but released. The museum felt lighter that night. Every creak of its beams, every gleam of its polished floor seemed to hum softly with peace. The spirits that had lingered so long had finally found their rest, and yet in the stillness there remained one echo, not a ghost, not a haunting. A reminder. When the lights went out each night after that, the museum guard who made his rounds sometimes caught a glimmer on the floor. Footprints that faded as quickly as they appeared, always leading toward the Tuskegee display. Sometimes, in the deep quiet between midnight and dawn, the faint hum of an old engine would roll softly through the halls, lasting only a few seconds before silence returned. It never frightened him. It never would, because he knew what it meant. It meant memory doesn't die. It takes flight. It circles the world until it finds peace. And somewhere, far above the quiet town, high in skies no plane could reach, an old black man in an old jacket was finally home, flying not for war or duty, but for freedom itself, The guard never saw him again. But every time he looked up at the planes suspended in the museum's still air, he felt the truth like sunlight in his chest. The stories of the forgotten are not forgotten at all. They're just waiting for someone to remember, and that night someone finally did.